Hi, guys.
Howdy. How's everybody doing?
Great.
Staying alive? Michael, looks like you're back in an office.
Yes, it's not very full with people, but we are allowed back.
Progress. I was going to say either that or you have a very high resolution Zoom background. All right, we'll hang out for a couple of minutes while we wait for everybody else to join in.
Hi, Lee. Liliana's going to be joining a little bit later. Is it possible we could move deferred stream to the end of the agenda?
Yes, I'll fix that.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Lee, is there anything else to go into the agenda, or is it all up to date now?
There are a couple last few pull requests coming in that I'm merging, but we're almost there.
Okay, cool. Give me a shout when you've done that and I'll copy it into the notes.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think we have a pretty stable participant list, and I have merged in all of our agenda items. So I think it's safe to copy into the notes.
I created a new PR. I don't know if you see it like last minute one.
Just in the last minute, I merged the one that added you to the attendee list. I don't know if you added an
Okay.
additional one.
No, this one. Okay.
Okay, cool. Yep, I think we're good to go. Well, we don't have too deep an agenda, so hopefully the meeting doesn't last too late into the night for all of you Europeans. But we have a lot of really interesting things to talk about today. So first, as we always do, kicking off with a reminder that by joining, we all agree to the membership agreement, participation guidelines, and code of conduct. Links are in the agenda if you ever want a refresher on what's in those things. And let's go around and put names to faces, introduce each other. We will go in the order that it's listed in the agenda, and take this as an opportunity if you happen to have missed yourself there to send a pull request, though I think we might actually have near perfect coverage this time. So I'm at the top of the list, so I'll start. Hey everybody, I'm Lee. And next on the list is Abhimanyu.
Hey, so hello everyone, and I'm with Graph Labs at the moment, and yeah, that's it. Next is Matt.
Hi, I'm Matt. I'm at Facebook and I work on the GraphQL client, native client.
And Rob from First Dibs, working on deferred stream. Liliana's going to be joining a little bit later.
I'm Morris from IBM, working on a GraphQL proxy.
Mike Cohen, I work for Indeed, working on a lot of the GraphQL things that we have going on internally.
Hi, I'm Benji. I work on the GraphQL suite of open source projects, and I'm also working on the tagged type in GraphQL.
Hi, my name is Ivan. I help to maintain GraphQL.js and some other foundation repos.
Hi, I'm Dotan. I'm from the guild, and Uri from the guild is also here with us. He's not listed, but he's here.
Uri, you want to intro yourself?
Yeah, I'm Uri, not a lot to add. We maintain a couple of open source stuff and also are members in the foundation.
Great. Add yourself to the agenda, Yuri.
Oh, yeah, I will. Thanks.
I don't know if I see Hemant in the participants. He might also be joining late.
All right, I'll go then. Hey, my name is Antoine. I worked previously at AWS AppSync, and now I'm part of Netflix. And, yeah, maintain GraphQL Java a little bit.
Hey folks, I'm Vince. I work at New Relic, and I work on the Absinthe Elixir GraphQL library.
Hi, I'm Evan. I lead APIs at Shopify. I think I'm the last one on the agenda, so.
Yeah, but I actually did a pull request, but I somehow dropped out. But I'm Michael Stipe. I work with Chili Cream, and we are working on the .NET implementation of Chocolate.
I probably had a bad merge commit at some point, Michael. Sorry about that. Feel free to add yourself back in there.
Yeah.
I do remember seeing you in there, so I'm sure it was my fault. All right, well, thank you, everybody. Glad to see a bunch of familiar faces and a handful of new ones. Let's take a quick look at our agenda. Oh, we should make sure we have good coverage on note-taking. Benji is our perennial excellent note taker. Does anybody want to volunteer to help out Benji, especially when he's taking part in discussion?
Yeah, I can help as well.
Awesome, thank you, Anton. Okay, let's take a quick look at our agenda and make sure that everything here are the things we want to talk about today. We're going to talk about deprecation of inputs from Evan, the TypeScript migration process from Dotan and Yvonne, perhaps figure out the details of bootstrapping a GraphQL JS working group. Yvonne's going to talk about some GitHub infrastructure for helping manage our working groups. Rob and Liliana are going to give us another update on Defer and Stream, which I'm excited about because every month they have significant progress to share. And that's everything we have on the agenda right now. Is there anything else that you all would like to talk about while we're here today?
I just wanted a quick note to say thanks everyone for your feedback on the tag type. If anyone hasn't given feedback and would like to, please do so. I have updated the spec based on some of the feedback, but there's still more work from me required, so that's why it's not an agenda item.
Great to know.
Apart from that, I wanted to get some clarifications regarding the spec, so I had some specific questions. So I will just discuss them at the end of the meeting.
Okay.
Thank you.
I wanted to also make an announcement. So we had GraphQL Foundation participated in Google Summer of Code program, and Namar, he implemented advanced parser. So we tried to unify GraphQL JS and graphical parser. So it's actually very helpful work. And we started GraphQL season of docs participation, and we have Caroline. You probably know her from GraphQL. She's very active in GraphQL ecosystem, and she will help with frequently asked questions on GraphQL.org. And as a community bonding period, she actually took effort of triaging stuff and like merging. So a lot of progress on GraphQL.org, and also if you want to help, subscribe to GraphQL.org repo and please review frequently asked questions PRs. Yeah, she will start work in a couple of weeks. Season of docs will start, and it's 3-month effort. So idea is to cover all the frequently asked questions about GraphQL, technical and non-technical.
That's awesome. That's our documentation and website is sort of always behind where we'd all like it to be. So I'm super excited that we're getting Summer of Code and Season of Docs folks' attention on it. Thanks, Yvonne, for helping mentor those people. I just kind of want to highlight that that's an area I'd love to see continued investment in. So if anybody has additional ideas for how we could improve that, or if they know of anybody who's excited about docs and championing our documentation over the long term, I feel like that thing really deserves a technical owner over the long haul. Right now, it's just kind of a volunteer effort from a handful of us. Most lately, it's mostly been Yvonne. Okay. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that Orta is helping. He have a busy schedule, but he's still helping and maintaining GraphQL.org.
Oh, that's awesome. Love Orta's work. That's great. Great to hear. All right, that's our agenda. I don't know if we translated last meeting's action items to issues. I don't think we did. I'm not going to spend too much time working through action items because there's only a handful of major ones that we need to follow up on. One, I'd love a volunteer, either Benji or Evan, I'll look to you both, of incorporating all of the sort of decision-making that happened over the last couple of months on input unions in our working groups, or Vince. We have video recordings of those. I think there was just a bunch of open issues to track those decisions on the input union RFC. If someone wants to, I think part of the reason why we haven't made progress on this is that it's not clear who's owning the next step. So I'd love a volunteer for the next step on that one.
I'm unable to do that and do the other things I need to do, so I've had to step back from that one, I'm afraid.
I'm happy to take it on as long as there's not any expectation that it will get done soon, because I'm also quite busy at the moment. But I'm happy to get to it like middle of September.
No expectation of it being done soon. I was just kind of looking through our issues and seeing that we logged those in May. So, you know, if we can get it done before the end of the year, I'll be happy. I'm sure you'll be able to exceed my expectations in that capacity. But yeah, thank you for volunteering to take point on that. And shout if you need any particular help, we can also kind of chop it up and make progress on it that way. I just want someone to own it. The other piece is on me, which is cutting a version of the spec. This is on me and Brian, our program manager. We're still finalizing, there's a long tail of people who haven't signed membership agreements, who have contributed to the repo over the last 2 years, that Brian is chasing down. Like that's truly the thing that's keeping us from cutting the spec. We want to make sure that this would be the first cut within the GraphQL Foundation, and we want to make sure we're doing it sort of by the legal books that we set out for ourselves. So that's the reason for the delay there. But when I talked to him last week, we had made significant progress. So I'm really hoping that we can resolve this relatively soon.
On that topic, Lee, I think it was proposed that we would have a review bot to ensure that people, when they even raise the pull requests, had already done the paperwork. Is that something that's in place or coming into place soon?
It's coming. This one is also on Brian. He promised that he would put this in place, and he knows exactly the technology he wants to do. The thing that he wants to get in place first is front load that tool with a bunch of already signed membership agreements. That way, for the handful of you who are routinely contributing to the repos and routinely showing up to these meetings, you don't have like an additional point of friction where you have to re-sign it. Especially for people who their signatures is from their like corporate body instead of them as an individual. Like that's really annoying to have to figure out how to go relitigate with whoever your legal representative is. So he's making sure that that tool gets front loaded with all those first and like links it up with everyone's GitHub usernames. That way, ideally, most of everybody on this call who's pretty regular contributors just won't even notice that the tool's introduced, and instead it'll just be newcomers. That'll just be a gut check to make sure that they've done that. But that will dramatically improve. The goal is basically to line up the introduction of that tool with the time that we cut the spec. That way, next time we cut the spec, this is a non-issue. You know, we just literally pull from the tool instead of having to spend a whole bunch of Brian's time wrangling people. But yes.
I also have a question. I imagine stuff into spec from time to time, especially like mostly like editorial stuff or internal stuff, SRA grid or RFC stuff. So I don't want to step on your or Brian toes in this process. So if at some point you need to stop merging stuff, like just ping me or create an issue.
Okay. Good to know. I think you're probably fine at the moment. If you spot that those changes are coming from new contributors, then maybe just flag that to Brian in particular. And you can just ping him on Slack and let him know that you haven't seen that particular person contribute before, and he can double check that they've signed their agreements. So you can be the human version of the bot that Benji was talking about in the short time.
Actually, most of PRs are from new contributors. People actually reading the spec and seeing small details and creating one-time PRs. So on the spec repo, we don't have like most of the PRs, absolute majority of them is like from one-time contributors. So this tool is a kind of critical.
Well, first of all, that's a great thing. That's a great problem to have, that we have a bunch of contributors to the spec. But yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So we'll make sure that you flag new contributors to Brian before you merge their pull requests. That way he can double check that they've signed a membership agreement. Or you can also just kind of proactively ask in the pull request. You can just ask like, hey, just checking, have you signed the membership agreement already? And just like toss a link to it. And they'll either say yes or they'll go sign it for you.
We
But
can
good call out.
I will add checklist, or if somebody wants to help, just a checklist in the issue template. So like I signed agreement, I think it's the best way until we have it all.
That's a good idea. I'll mention that to Brian. Okay. Any other thoughts on spec cut or other previous action items from previous meetings? Let's talk about deprecation of inputs. Evan, I'll hand it to you.
Thanks, Lee. Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add to what I left in my comment yesterday. I don't know if everybody's had a chance to read that though, so I'll summarize. Basically, the only question left in terms of deprecating inputs is whether whether the spec should permit deprecating an input that is required, so an argument or an input field. There were two concerns raised with deprecating required inputs. Originally, one of those was that deprecations are intended to be actionable. And so if the input is required, then you can't really migrate away from it. And the other is that introspection does not include deprecated objects or things, members, I don't know, by default, which could break tooling that is now no longer receiving required arguments as part of their introspection response. Shopify has a vested interest in being able to deprecate required things. We have a use case for that, so I volunteered to look into these and look into our use case and see kind of what shook out. For the first problem of deprecations being actionable, I don't really think that ends up being much of a blocker. There are cases, even apart from Shopify's use case, where the action that comes from a deprecation doesn't happen inside the schema. And so it doesn't make sense to block it on that front. However, the second problem of introspection is a much bigger one. That is definitely a significant problem that we would be potentially breaking clients if we deprecated required objects. I do still think that GraphQL should support deprecating required inputs. And so my suggestion was that we slightly change the rules for introspection and have introspection return required arguments even if they are deprecated, on the theory that like introspection should always give you back the stuff that is absolutely necessary, even if you say you don't want it. So that was kind of my first, I wanted to float that to the group. I know it's a bit of a weird proposal, but I wanted to see what people thought of that idea of just working around this problem by changing the rules for introspection a little bit.
So since this would be a new argument being added to the input fields on the type, so I don't see any major issue with omitting only the nullable deprecated fields, but I think maybe the name of that field might make sense to be something other than include deprecated, because that very explicitly says whether or not you should include deprecated. I'm not sure what name you would use, like include nullable deprecated seems a bit like long and messy, but maybe we can solve it with naming.
I'm not sure, well, possibly. I think renaming that field in the introspection query is breaking in its own right and makes the change a lot kind of messier from that perspective, since people will be using the old field name in their introspection queries already in some cases.
This is on the input fields field on the dunder type, which doesn't have that argument currently, right?
My understanding was that this argument was at like the top level of introspection, but I'm not actually sure. Lee?
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
The include deprecated argument to introspection, where is that actually placed in the introspection query? Benji suggested that we would basically have to add it to input args again, a parallel version to the one on outputs, and so we could just call it something else, which is actually like really nice and simple if that's the case.
I've linked in the chat to the relevant part of the spec, but yes, it's added to the fields and enum values field within the dunder type in introspection. So you're effectively proposing adding another argument to the input fields field on the dunder type. So yeah, you need to add an argument there anyway. So I'm just proposing whatever argument you add might not need to have the same name as the previous ones.
Well, that's a good point, actually. We don't technically need to add an argument there. I mean, it would be nice for consistency, but if we can't come up with a name, we could also just say you always get all of your inputs back. And introspection doesn't provide that option. I didn't even realize that those were separate. I thought it was a single flag that controlled the entire introspection output.
Maybe I'm missing something, but just a question. Why can't you just introspect and then transform the result into whatever you need? I mean, you have all the data and all the details. You can just change the introspection result, remove fields, and change the JSON structure according to your needs. I mean, maybe I'm missing something, but it sounds like
by default, the GraphQL server does not return deprecated inputs, or rather does not return deprecated fields. So you don't even have that data to play with.
Oh, okay. That was the missing piece. Thank you.
Yeah. And I just don't know if the field's not deprecated, the field comes back, but one of the required inputs to that field is deprecated. Does introspection, like the thing that Benji just sent out, there's the include deprecate on the field, but not on the arg.
I think that behavior is undefined right now.
Because it doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist, yeah.
I think it's undefined in the current proposal for the spec as well, because nobody thought of it until just now. So great question.
I mean, so you could just have that if the field does not, if the field's not deprecated, you send it and all its args regardless, even after we start allowing people to deprecate.
That's certainly the simplest solution, and it addresses this problem as well, is that those values don't kind of recurse. They apply to the immediate return value of that field and not to any of its children. So if any arguments come back, you'd have to explicitly ask for include deprecated. Actually, Benji, the other option besides renaming it would just be to change the default value. So include deprecated defaults to true for inputs instead of false. And that provides kind of a more structural consistency with the other version of that argument.
That seems reasonable.
Though
still, I would have problems with the name not doing exactly what the name suggests it should do.
Yeah, I think in that case, if we change the default, then we can make it do what it says on the tin. And if you don't include deprecated and you are missing some arguments, then deal with it. It was what you explicitly asked for.
One problem with it is, like, in our design principle, we have consistency. So things should be consistent. And it's like we have trade-offs. Either we design for compatibility or we design for eventual consistency. So I have a general question about breaking changes. So currently in our design principle, we promise not to break existing clients. Like if you just update to queries from existing clients. So my interpretation of that was, if you just update like GraphQL.js or any other libraries, everything should work as it works, unless you start explicitly using new feature. So like if API owner decide to start using new feature, in this case it's like deprecating arguments or input fields, it's okay if it will break clients. If API owner knows about such client, it's up to him to decide is it worth to use new feature or is it worth to, so like general question about like compatibility. Should we care if we break something? If something is break, if IP owner explicitly decide to use new feature.
I think the problem.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Evan.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think the problem from our perspective is that it's not something that we expect clients to like. It's not something that clients can like change their behavior and then we know we can use it. It's something that basically means deprecating a required argument would be have unknown breaking effects across our ecosystem forever.
My question is whether this is a problem outside of Shopify's use case. Like we should account, this was basically my suggestion last time we talked about this, was we can loosen the spec to account for a Shopify specific runtime change. That way you can still claim what you have is spec compliant GraphQL, even though you're like, yeah, the spec says should, and like most compliant implementations implement that should, but we don't for this specific reason. Or is this a general problem that we expect people will run into, and therefore we should significantly design around it? I'm worried that we're over rotating on this particular problem, because I think we're really giving up a lot of value by not treating deprecation of all elements of the schema in the same fashion. And if deprecation of arguments behaves meaningfully different from deprecation of fields or anything else, then that's just like yet another concept that we have to teach people and a potential pitfall and source of confusion. And that's a real cost. So we need to weigh that against the value that we're getting out of it.
Yeah, for sure. I don't have any other concrete examples of other schemas that would benefit from this right now. I can, like, for example, hypothetical example though, you've written your schema and then you decide that you're going to re-implement it in a different backend language. And you're going to expose that for routing simplicity, you're going to expose that on a different path or a different URL to your users. So what you really want is all of your users to switch from like a myschema.com/1 to myschema.com/ like re-implemented in Java or whatever. And most of the schema is the same, but there are a few fields that have been removed or changed or different. And like, you want to be able to mark those as deprecated in your old version of the schema without changing the semantics of them, which doesn't make sense under the old implementation. It's a bit contrived, but
yeah,
it seems legitimate as a hypothetical use case, at least.
It is a legitimate hypothetical use case. And I think having an escape hatch that allows for that, like if your runtime has some flag that you can like disable the rule that checks that a deprecated field isn't still required, it would allow you that escape hatch to do such a conversion. I suspect that most who would find themselves in that same situation would want to include a two-phase migration, right? First, you would want to make relevant, like first you would want to get rid of anything deprecated in your local schema. Then you could cleanly point from old implementation URL to new implementation URL, knowing that like just the URL pointing was the thing that changed instead of like simultaneously changing queries. And then you could unlock adding new things. And then that could be like a relatively smooth 3-step process, as opposed to having to do all those simultaneously. My sense is that's not the way that you would do it at Shopify because of the constraints that you've applied, and that's reasonable. But I don't know if that's the pattern. Like, I don't know if we would want to encourage, because the other thing that I'm a little bit nervous of is whatever we encode in the spec is what becomes sort of the basic default way of doing things, which ends up setting precedent for how people build things. And you can imagine if this rule was in place a while ago, perhaps you would have approached API versioning and field deprecation in a different way, even within Shopify. And so we should kind of think like, what elements of this are things that we want to evangelize and encourage, and what do we want to think of as like you know, retroactively, like, oh yeah, these were just kind of Shopify specific, but we should limit their impact on the overall GraphQL ecosystem. And my sense is that this is one of those, you know, like the overall versioning scheme that you've built is reasonable, but like this particular nuance of it feels like an accident of history rather than like a designed intent of the versioning process. Is that accurate?
No.
Okay. Cool. Well, then that's my perception, but it's
No,
not accurate.
I think it's totally fair from the outside. I think from the inside, this feels like our versioning system has a lot of deliberate design philosophy built into it, and I think we would have done the same thing even had this rule existed before. It's unfortunate that, yeah, I guess if I had to make a concrete prediction, it would be that in the long term, more people are going to version their schemas like we do. But that's obviously very hand wavy, and I don't have anything to back it up. Besides, it seems to work well for us, and I suspect it will work. I suspect other people will run into the same problems we did and have to solve them.
Yeah. And I don't mean to say that the entire approach that you're taking is not one we should encourage. I think overall it seems to be working for you. But there's details of it that I think we can look at with a critical eye, especially as they reflect back onto the spec. And like that's really the point that I want to make here, is that I think like having different URLs for different versions of your overall schema seems like a reasonable thing to do, but keeping the previous ones completely immutable is maybe an over constraint when it comes to like this particular kind of problem. Because if you could say, oh yeah, this field or this argument used to be required, but it's going away in the next one, so let's find a way to backport that behavior to the previous one by adding a default value. It's like that could be a useful escape valve.
We did consider that, and like we were quite willing to make that escape valve. Like that was actually the first thing we looked at internally, but it causes semantic problems, because often you're making this, and this goes to other thing, to the migrations being effective like outside of the schema. You're making this optional because some other behavior has changed, or because this or because that. And so suddenly you can't just make an argument optional. You have to backport all of these other changes to that version, and that becomes very complicated. And making the argument optional without anything else just makes no semantic sense for that version.
Yeah, I understand that. That makes sense.
I think
I should add just also what I put at the end of my comment is like, it sounds like there's some pushback here, and that's okay. Like Shopify is okay if we decide to make this a must. I think probably that's a mistake, but my confidence on that is so low that I'm happy to and I do see the value in having a clearer path and a more consistent forcing function for other developers to migrate their schemas consistently. So,
for what it's worth, I'm supportive of having this be a should instead of a must, if it means that the majority of implementations in open source, at least, do, like, by default they do the should behavior, which is probably the right reading of should in the spec. But if there's a switch that you can just say like, all right, the thing that checks that if it's deprecated, it can't be required, I can just turn that off. Then you could just do that within Shopify. You'd still be spec compliant. And it doesn't seem like there's a huge downside to that to me, unless I'm missing some potential pitfall there. But I'd rather us just loosen the language on what's required within the spec than like explicitly design around it by having the default of include all deprecated arguments by default, which I think really hurts the value of the deprecation feature in GraphQL, or add some other piece to the introspection API. Because then I think we're kind of over rotating of like, oh, what happens if someone depends on this on a client, and it's like, if they're just using the Shopify API, like it's not going to be a big deal for them.
So the thing is, if you just make it should and don't address the introspection thing, then we probably won't be able to use it anyways, because there would be the risk of the introspection bug happening and breaking our clients. So we would just not use it anyway.
Oh, I see what you're saying. That might also be reasonable, just considering that the vision for API versioning set out in the GraphQL spec is it's just a different vision from the one that Shopify is using. I think that's the source of the technical conflict here. And maybe what we're doing is we're trying to take two things that are the same by name but different by detail and try to smush them together, and it's just kind of not working. So maybe this is an indication that we need to kind of revisit the like exposed metadata kind of proposals that would allow us to say this is like Shopify deprecated or something along those lines. Maybe that's crazy.
Yeah, people actually ask previously for experimental flag or alpha beta flags, and they have similar semantics. In a sense, I totally agree with you that we're mixing two things. We're mixing like stuff deprecated, like in Spec deprecated means deprecated in this version, and you can migrate inside this version. And what I getting from Evans, it's like different directive, like will be removed in next version, or you should migrate until next version, something like that. And it's like much what people already want, like experimental, beta, like preview. People actually want this type of tags. So, and I think it would be useful to show them inside GraphQL with text messages.
Yeah, what do you think, Evan?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, GraphQL has a very explicit vision for how schemas evolve, and that's kind of not the vision that we went with, and that's definitely the root of all of these problems. I'm okay with us working around this basically on our end. If GraphQL wants to continue to drive that vision, and I think like GraphQL's vision for schema evolution will continue to work for the vast majority of schemas and the vast majority of companies. We're in a bit of a unique situation. Not totally unique, but an edge case at the very least.
Yeah.
I think GraphQL vision is a subset of Shopify vision, because like it's understand in your current versioning, you can replace some deprecated field inside the same version, like sometimes.
So we have
just like,
yeah. So for example, like in version X, there could be some field, and then in version Y, that field is completely gone, and a new field has replaced it. And so then in version X, we mark that field as deprecated, even though there's no replacement in the same schema graph.
Yeah, but is there a situation where you can migrate? Like, do you have like stuff where you add like a new field the next and deprecate field the next, or you don't do it at all?
We definitely can do a slower, smoother migration, like mark it as deprecated and add the new field in a particular version, but not remove it until later. We just wanted to give ourselves the flexibility, because we had a couple of use cases for this directly of like doing hard and fast migrations when the situation was called for, in a way that still gave our third-party developers a chance to do like a controlled migration on their end. Anyway, I don't really want to get into litigating our exact versioning choices. It's very interesting. I've spent the last like 2 years on it, so I can talk about it forever, but it's not what we're here to talk about.
Sounds like it's worth a conference talk.
Yeah, if it ever finishes if we ever can. Anyway.
Virtual conference talk.
Yeah, so in TLDR for the specific GraphQL spec change, then I think it sounds like everybody wants to go with must. There's not doesn't sound like a lot of value in should for us if there's not a lot of buy-in for the introspection change, and nobody else has been asking for this. So I'm happy to just get out of the way on this one now.
Another action point I can suggest, just it's useful not only to this particular proposal, but to understand the ecosystem in general. Can we gather statistics on how people use introspection? For example, if we discover that nobody actually using introspection in production clients, if it's only used like in graphical or Postman or other similar tools, it's not an issue. And maybe you can gather such statistic in Shopify if you have like development, like flag for production clients or something.
We don't have development versus production distinguished for our third-party clients, so we can't know, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm a little bit worried. That's a reasonable suggestion, but I'm worried that we'll get back stats that we don't know how to fully interpret to make a decision anyway. So I do think it's worthwhile to just think about this kind of problem from like what we are enabling or disabling from a design direction, rather than just like what are we breaking or not breaking in current usage. Again, I think it sounds like we've worked through the actual decision detail here, which is really boiling down to a must versus a should. And if you're saying if it's a should, you still wouldn't use it, then that implies that the value from downgrading from must to should is low. And therefore it should probably stay at must. And sounds reasonable to me.
Technical question. So I updated PR against GraphQL.js, and it's ready. I think it's like right now it's maybe like not. I need to rebase it a little bit, but it was up to date like a couple of weeks ago. So can I merge it? And if we reach stage 2,
merge the GraphQL.js change?
Yeah. And it's
I think it's safe to merge that change. You should make sure that it is inclusive of what we just decided here about the required argument.
Yeah. So it's have validation rule saying if you put deprecated on required, you get validation error. It's already in. After last I updated it after last working group.
Great. Do we have the ability to change this spec proposal? Because this is from Kevin Smithson, who's not here.
Yeah, you can.
Okay.
Since you have rights, you can. There is like GitHub to GH, I believe it's called. It's create a clone, and you can push to his repo basically because you have commit rights, and he allowed to do that.
I think I'd like to only increase this from stage 1 to stage 2 once there's language included in the spec proposal that accounts for this schema validation rule that you're talking about.
So I suggest maybe we create a branch on basically adopt PR, create a branch on spec repo, merge it into a branch, and create PR from a branch. So a person who want to help like update a language.
Since you've been working on the GraphQL.js change, do you want to champion this going forward?
Yeah, I think like changes. I need somebody who is native speaker to review my change. I will ping Benji. He was super helpful with reviewing grammar, and editorial changes. By the way, it's like great help for me because it's really hard for a non-native speaker to review and match. I was constantly under pressure. My own grammar knowledge is not good, but I imagine other people stuff. So Benji was like super helpful in that way.
Sounds great. Okay, well, that's the next actions for moving this forward is getting the GraphQL JS change in and then advancing the spec text here. And I'll leave them both on you, Yvonne, as next actions. All right, moving on. Dotan, you have the next two agenda items. Do you want to start with update on the TypeScript migration?
Actually, I added this to the agenda because I wanted to hear from Ivan. What are the next steps, if there are any blockers, and how can we help with it? The next item, I think we can combine it, I mean, or maybe even the entire thing could be merged into a single meeting. I saw that Ivan already suggested date and time next week. So yeah, maybe just a short update on the TypeScript migration, and if we can help in any way, we're here.
Yeah, like, so some context. Yopera was like pretty helpful to see trade-offs of migration. Because like basically idea is not to lose what we have right now in fall. And like one blocker from which I want to actually like relevant to this working group. So for TypeScript migration, I try to move as much as possible work into a flow in preparation for TypeScript migration. But at some point we actually need to pull a plug and do it. And like working on a branch is problematic. So basically at some point we need a feature freeze, and it's mean like feature freeze for everything. Like it should be like a couple of weeks or 1 week or 2 weeks. I don't know like what problem we will experience during migration. Hopefully it will be like just a week, but maybe like 2 weeks. So basically it will freeze merging any PRs to reference implementation. Just if everybody okay, if there is something urgent, because like working on merging stuff and migrating at the same time, it's problematic.
I think we can go on with your original suggestion. I mean, combine those. We can create a branch for all the TypeScript work, merge everything there, keep it updated like a rebase every day. And when we want to get it in, or if we'll have like conflicts or things that are hard to do, we can do feature freeze and maybe even shorten it, not like a week or 2 weeks, maybe a day or two.
There is a problem with it. To do proper TypeScript conversion, we need to do a breaking change to drop all TypeScript version. So yeah, it's question of technical thing. Let's actually discuss it on the call, because not everybody interested in JavaScript implementation or like TypeScript in general. What I want to tell about TypeScript, I think it's really important to allow for new contributors to contribute. Flow was a severe limiting factor for why we don't get a lot of contribution. I actually spoke with like even people from Python community, and they suggested that one of the blockers for contributing back to reference implementation was that they don't know Flow, and TypeScript is easier for them. So I think it's like one of the top priority, not only for JavaScript ecosystem, but for reference implementation in general. So I'm all for it. I just need figure out how to do it. And yeah, and about distributing work, it's not my, I need to actually work on it and figure out. Another thing, I will probably contact Matt about flow support, because at some point we need to figure out how to better do it. Because if we just migrate to TypeScript, we'll lose flow types. So I would definitely use some help with maintaining flow types or figuring what to do with flow types without like breaking flow clients and Facebook specifically.
Got it. So any issues, if you need help, we can put like someone to work on it with you. We can help more than one. I mean, if you need any help, we are here.
Yeah, I need to learn how to create issues, help wanted, how to separate the work on smaller chunks and manage it. Hopefully always Google Summer of Code and Summer of Docs actually helping me with that. I'm like learning new skills. So, and Hacktoberfest is coming. So I actually want to at least try to participate in Hacktoberfest. I think like community involvement is really great. So yeah, definitely we'll open an issue. And plus we will have this call and we can brainstorm. It's not a good thing to brainstorm on this call because we like stretching the schedule, but on separate GraphQL.js call, we can actually spend time brainstorming and figure out the strategy.
Got it.
Plus, Lee, I saw that you basically trying to do the same with Immutable.js, so you can also share some ideas on how to like facilitate community involvement and stuff.
Well, I can't say I'm doing a particularly great job at that for Immutable.js right now, but I'm hoping to pick that back up. I think one thing that might help is starting a trusted group of people who have committer rights. So it seems like maybe Yuri or Dotan, blessing them with committer rights, as long as y'all are in tight communication about making sure your strategies are aligned and you're landing stuff in the ways that you want to be doing it as a team. That could help accelerate, because then as you could kind of pass the buck back and forth as to who's needs to be accountable for code review and merging things. That might be helpful, but certainly getting time just to talk things through is going to be the most helpful thing. So do you need any help with scheduling that? Or I think Brian can probably help if there's any mechanics of actually just setting up a GraphQL.js specific meeting.
Yeah, it was my action item about agenda item about discussing how to set up groups. So I create issue on GraphQL.js and pin it on top. Another thing, actually, like previously we had like some issues with onboarding contributors and stuff, and we discussed it with Brian. An idea is to have a clear policy and transparent process on doing that, because right now we have a bunch of people with commit rights and no clear criteria when we can like remove them or add them. So it's like a little bit a mess, especially since we inherit all the committers from Facebook, basically like 60 or 70 of them.
Yeah. I agree that we eventually need that. I don't think that needs to be a blocker for moving forward in the short term, especially as it becomes an ongoing thing and there's more and more maintainers. I think the vast majority of the current maintainer list are former contributors to that repo from Facebook who don't really show up all that often. I'm more interested in creating a core consortium of people who are regular code reviewers and mergers, because right now that's primarily you and very occasionally Matt. And I think getting Dotan or Yuri involved would be a helpful thing. But let's make the next step getting that meeting. It sounds like you have a proposed time for next week. And let me or Brian know if you need any help setting that up.
Actually, I suggested a date 2 weeks.
Okay.
Like to have people to put it on a schedule and to have time. We will start. Actually, we started a newsletter for GraphQL Foundation, so it would be great to include it in there. So, like, I think for such initial calls, it makes sense to advertise it as much as possible, especially if we want to be like open to new contributors.
Cool. Anything else to add on that, Yuri or Dutan?
No, I think that's it. Thank you, Ivan.
Ivan, do you want to follow up with the thoughts that you had for the GitHub infrastructure for managing working groups?
Yeah, so like we have right now we have graphical working group, GraphQL over HTTP working group, and GraphQL over HTTP actually was adopted by Foundation. So now it's also on the Foundation. So like 2 working groups. We have main working group, and we will have GraphQL JS working group. So it's 4, and we have like more or less 4.5 because we have input union working group. So it's like 5 working group at the same time. And issue is that like if you start GraphQL JS working group, how like I want to copy the stuff from GraphQL working group agenda and notes and stuff. Maybe we don't need like such detailed notes and videos would be just okay or not. It's up to discussion on a call, but like one thing, like where we put this agenda or notes. If we create a folder, it will pollute Git log with bunch of like unrelated stuff, and also CI/CD doesn't make sense for adding agenda items or so we cannot add expensive things on like CI, for example, because like so having a branch option, but at the same it's hard visibility, and we still have like pollution of issues and PRs. It's less a problem, but still not ideal solution. So I look like in how it's managed in, for example, Node.js Foundation, and it's separate repos. But it's separate. If we create separate repos, it's work for GraphQL working group. So we don't have anything inside Spec repo. And it's also beneficial. We can generate changelog from it or do other stuff. And people can use like bisect or some other cool features. But for if every other working group will create a repo, will hard visibility of like Foundation projects. And also if, for example, we try to preserve input union stuff, also some temporary group. Input union is an example of like temporary, like it's temporary permanent group. So it's happening every month, but it's still like with clear end goal, group with clear end goal. We want to preserve some stuff from this group. And if it's separate repo, it will like be like dead repo on Foundation organization. So I wanted to suggest creating a separate GitHub org just for working groups. And additional benefit for it is that we can create some scripts and rules and template repo that people can copy, and some like other automatization stuff, and also be really liberal with giving commit rights, more liberal than like stuff that can affect end users. So what do you think about this idea of setting separate GitHub org just for working groups, where every working group will have a separate repo?
I think this sounds fine. I mean, either one repo or multiple repos. I mean, probably depends on like permissions. I would like to suggest to consider use ZenHub. It's built on top of GitHub, so it's like a board where you can track action items, progress on tasks, and stuff like that. And everything is behind the scenes is managed on GitHub as issues, so it's easier to track. And also, you can have like your own internal status and still have like a public, like an option to share it to the public. So it's nice. Maybe it can help to track progress on tasks.
That's a good point. I support adding more tooling and help for managing our meeting structure. I'm a little hesitant about creating a separate GitHub org just because of discoverability. One suggestion that I will make, just to help create some rules around when it's appropriate to make a repo versus when you should do something else, is I want us to make a distinction between separate working groups and subcommittees. So the input unions is not a separate working group. That's a subcommittee of this working group. And for those, you know, I think we've been a little bit lax taking notes and tracking those things. And really what it's looked like is one single RFC file. I think when we realize, in hindsight, we should have realized that in breaking it out into a subcommittee, that should have been a moment where we started tracking agenda items, notes, and kept the same kind of rigor that we keep for this main meeting. We could do that with folder structure. I don't think we need branches. I don't think we need anything particularly complicated from the Git side. I think we could just have a subcommittees folder, and then there's an input union subcommittee, and we could have a subcommittee for any of the things that we go and break off for. I think really the only, and even I'm happy for to consider a lot of these things subcommittees, like GraphQL.js. I could go either way as to whether we want to consider that a subcommittee of this overall working group, or if we want to consider that its own thing, whichever will make it easier to manage. But hopefully that solves the problem that you're talking about of like dead repos for only temporary working groups. The subcommittees only need to exist as long as they serve a purpose, and then at that point they leave behind a folder full of notes.
So on a note about GraphQL.js in particular, I think most of the current issues are coming from and problems are coming from JavaScript community. So GraphQL.js as a reference implementation, there is like some issues. For example, with it's taken me a lot of time to review stream and defer stuff. But other than that, we don't have like ongoing issues where GraphQL.js blocks or some problem with group side. But like TypeScript conversion and other stuff coming from JavaScript. So in that sense, it's not like subgroups, because like interests are I suspect like most of the stuff that we will discuss in this group is about GraphQL.js as production library for JavaScript community, and not about GraphQL.js reference implementation for GraphQL. So, and just to clarify, so you're suggesting creating a separate repo?
I think for anything that is a independent working group, a separate repo within the same org makes sense. The primary reason why I suggest keeping one org is just discoverability. You can say like, oh, what's everything that's under the GraphQL Foundation? And you can just go to one place and you can scroll down all of the various repos. Otherwise, we have to like help people navigate through the multiple GitHub orgs controlled by the GraphQL Foundation, and I think it'll become a point of confusion. The other, and I also think it's reasonable to rely on folder structure. Like if your meeting is tightly tied to another meeting in the form of a subcommittee, or tightly tied to a project in the form of a regular, like a maintainers meeting for that project, then it makes sense to just have a folder in that same repo. So for GraphQL.js, it might actually be reasonable just to put a folder at the top level that says meetings, and then you can just list agendas and notes as files in the meetings folder. That way, someone who like stumbles upon that repo and says, how can I help? Instead of having to know that there's a separate GitHub org that lists a repo that has a meeting for GraphQL.js, they find just like right there in the repo, they find the relevant notes that they need to follow along with.
Yeah, the problem with it is like rebasing stuff and like CI/CD. So we have pretty extensive CI.
Yeah, that's a trade-off.
Yeah, so we have like 11 separate flows in CI at the moment. So for something, it's overkill for thing when you try to add agenda items. Plus, actually, like the same with label stacks generating changelog. That's why I look into like Babel have a separate repo, Node.js have a separate repo. I believe Webpack have a separate repo. I think like fast moving, and even for GraphQL over HTTP, at the moment we have way more commits for working group folder than for rest of the spec, and it's dilute like progress, and if person goes there, he needs to scroll through pages by pages of people adding them into agenda instead of like getting what's actually happened on the repo. So I actually want to extract both. I want to extract GraphQL over HTTP. It's less pressing and less like, because it's still like a spec repo, so it's don't have CI/CD or stuff. But for GraphQL.js, it's like it's critical.
Okay, sounds like a separate repo is the right thing to do. Support you in that. Yeah,
By
good
the way,
suggestion from
I think
Dotan.
GraphQL.js is using GitHub Actions right now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you can ignore the specific directories and then it won't pollute the CI and yeah, it won't affect it.
It's like partial solution. So generating release notes from changelog, or it will require us to constantly solving other issues. Even if we address GitHub Actions, it's create other things like. So I think it's two separate process: development as software and managing working group, even for the same software.
Okay, we can help with that. I mean, we're doing similar things in our repos. So if you need help with that,
yeah, I can actually create a repo and add you there, and you can create PR, copy the structure of GraphQL working group.
Sounds like a plan. Okay, let's keep things moving. And Liliana, I see you've joined us. Welcome. Just in time for you and Rob to take us through what's new with Defer and Stream.
Hey, so the first thing that I wanted to talk about is I have a link in the agenda RFC FAQ, and it's a question that we've been getting a lot recently, which is why we don't support defer on fields. So our proposal so far has only been on fragments and inline fragments. And our reasoning for that was the original Apollo implementation was only on fields, and we ran into a bunch of problems with that, where it's kind of, if you need more than one field, it's hard to coordinate the loading state of all the different fields before you render it. And so our thoughts are that fragments are going to be the more common use case. And it is kind of easy if you just have a single field to wrap it in an inline fragment. But Ivan also brought up that you could make the same argument with skip and defer. So I kind of wanted to get everyone's thoughts on this decision.
I think one problem also with the Apollo solution is that it had to be nullable then. Right. I don't know if you remember using it, but I remember it. And so they had this issue with non-nullable fields that then were omitted from the original payload and were delivered later. And that's why they mandated that you have it nullable. And there were lots of things around that made it not really nice to use. And I think that going down with the Facebook solution that basically was in Relay is a much cleaner way to deal with defer and string.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So from a Facebook perspective, I believe Kawai is the clear person who would know, but I believe we even tried to do it to allow at defer and stream on fields initially, and ended up finding one, it wasn't needed, and two, the boundary where most developers wanted to defer and stream was at the fragment level, and not doing fields, at least initially, made it much, much easier to build the infrastructure required, which so for adding something to a spec, if our goal is to add the minimal useful thing to start, that's a good argument for now we're deferring building out field deferral until it's proven that exactly is needed.
Yeah, that's what we've been thinking too. Just because it came up a couple of times, I wanted to go over it again with the group.
My point, because I left a comment, so my point was that basically you can have the same argument for any field directive. You can force any field directive to be on an inline fragment. And we actually support inline fragment without on type for that reason. So you can apply, skip, and include on group of fields. So like one of the thing in a spec is consistency. So if for example, like experimental implementation included, and we discover it's hard for API for like client libraries, Apollo or Relay or other to handle it, we can know for sure that we need to remove it. That's experimentation phase. But if we never add it, we basically we'll get inconsistent API with rest other directives, and like if we decide to add it later, we'll don't have enough data points to make this decision. Like I actually think it's like pretty simple change in GraphQL.js. Like I don't know about Relay or client libraries, but in GraphQL.js, I think it's like would be super simple because we need to support multiply inline fragments anyway. Nothing prevents me from creating like 2, 3, 5 of them. So like from GraphQL.js perspective, I think it's like 20 lines maybe. Like if we need to add tests, maybe like 50, 100 lines of code.
Yeah, I definitely agree that it's not hard to implement on the server side. And the other thing is it might lead might lead to people using fields more often than fragments, and then you kind of get like a UX where a lot of things are just popping in all over the place because it's kind of difficult to manage with a fragment. So I don't know if we want to like encourage, if having some field support there is encouraging that, or there's like a little bit of a barrier. I'm not really sure if that's a great argument or not for or against. But yeah, is the consistency with other directives versus a more minimal spec, I guess, is the balance.
I'm less worried about consistency here, just because there are very few directives that are included in the spec. So it would not be, it's not my intention that every new directive that we also add to the spec has to match the existing ones. We should treat each new directive with, you know, whatever the appropriate design is for that thing. And I think your point of why it makes sense to apply this only to fragments instead of fields. At first, I was also a little bit confused by this, so thank you for the clarification. I think it makes sense. And you can actually even specifically point out why this is different from skip or include. Skip and include are synchronous. So if you put a skip field on two sibling fields, or the skip directive on two sibling fields, then either both are skipped or neither are skipped, you know, if they use the same argument. And so you're not gonna, like, that's not gonna have some impact on your UX. There's no pitfall from listing the skip multiple times. Could you lift that up onto an inline fragment and write the skip once? You could, but it would have observably identical behavior. The same is not true for defer, because each usage of defer is an async boundary. So having one at the fragment level implies I'm going to wait one time for these two fields, as opposed to having two defers on two sibling fields means I'm going to wait 2 times for each of these fields independently, which could arrive in either order. And those have a different impact on your UX. So if your observation is that it would be easy for people to write such a query without the intent of that UX behavior, then we should view that as a pitfall, and therefore designing around the pitfall is wise. That to me is the clearest sign of like, hey, I have this inline fragment, so I can defer my one field. That seems annoying. Why is that? And you're like, great question. Well, when people are using this experiment in production, what we find is they start with one field and then they add a second one. And like, what you have to think about, what's the path from one field to 2 fields? And like, this is the path that makes the most sense for the UX, is to make people be thoughtful about the UX. And this is what we found helps them do that. I think that could be a reasonable argument.
Okay, I'm agree. The only one note I think is deserve like at least some explanation, maybe like note or something in the spec, because I'm not only one who will have this question, especially like language implementers. They're reading through maybe like even stuff about non-normative note about best practice or like query evolution, like you add more fields and it's better to start to a group than transform from field to inline fragment. I think, yeah, so I agree with your arguments. It actually makes sense, but I think it's need to be addressed in the spec, because our spec is actually good on giving intention, not only specifying stuff, but explaining why.
Yeah.
And a good basis for this is also the Apollo implementation, because they tried it out with the field. And if you read through their specification, they lined out all the problems that you face with their solution. So they wrote it down. We could take that as a base.
You should be able to avoid the pitfall that they fell into around nullable, like requiring it to be nullable. That seemed like a design mistake of returning null when you intend to defer, but maybe it was just like a tooling integration problem.
Yeah, and also there is the thing around that you really have an async boundary there, and that you have then to basically subscribe on the fields that you are waiting for. But they lined that things out, so there might be the documents still around. So
yeah, so I'll update this RFC PR with a more complete explanation and add some more detail to it so it's more fully laid out, and then we'll get that into the spec as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Yvonne. Having a non-normative note that's there that kind of helps people understand why it's built the way it is I mean, the more places that we describe it, the better. So having the FAQ is also helpful, but you'll catch them as they're reading that and wondering why it is the way it is. It's a good idea.
One thing I wanted to ask your opinion about is that I reviewed this PR and what I noticed is that there is some similarity with subscribe on an implementation level, and people previously actually ask a lot why we have separate function for execute and separate functions for subscribe. It's like some queries you put them into execute function and some queries inside subscribe function. So I actually want to look into can we unify execute, subscribe, and stream and defer, because they and reduce number of return values, types of return values. Maybe I don't know if it's outside the scope of this RFC or not, but maybe we can think about if we already adding asynchronously returning stuff into execute, maybe it's worth to think about unifying algorithms for execute and subscribe.
Yeah, we can think about that. My preference would be to do that after support is merged into execute.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, obviously if this experiment and go different, it's like experiment for a reason, because we're not 100% sure in the end result. And just like, yeah, I just think like in any end result of this RFC, we'll basically add asynchronous stuff into execute. We can change like anything. It executes asynchronously here to stay inside the execute. So it just like maybe it will influence design. No, I don't mean like necessary spec changes should be, especially in this stage, separate, but maybe we can figure out how we, for example, like I'm not sure, but has next also makes sense kind of in subscription context. For example, you can, if we already adding this field in possible return, it makes sense maybe for subscription also to signaling that subscription is ended. So it's last item of subscription and server is dropping it or something happens.
What other help do you both need for deference team at the moment?
So we're still working on getting async iterable resolver support merged. Yvonne mentioned there might be a memory leak, so I can look into writing a test for that like we had in iterol. And I think just some eyes on the spec PR would be great.
I have a general question around the different stream project, or like how do we have specific criteria when we say this is ready to be merged inside the spec?
Yes. There's like a phase guideline.
Yeah. Do we have more specific ones for this project, or are we applying the general rules?
That is a good question. My assumption is that we are applying the general rules, but if we want to kind of refine and say like, per the general rules specifically for this project, here's what we're looking for, we can do that. I think especially since this effort is a huge change to the surface area of GraphQL, getting some of these GraphQL JS changes merged and accessible only behind a flag that you explicitly have to turn on, so that people can start using this and figuring out how it affects tooling and looking for bugs. Like, my sense is that that is where we will find the most significant changes to the spec, is realizing that a bug is significant and actually has a meaningful change on the spec text. So that's my sense of where I would place the priority, is making sure that the reference implementation backing is we have quite a high degree of confidence in it. But otherwise, my sense is that we'd follow along with our usual guidelines.
Okay, I'm not asking without intent, and my intent is actually to require a second implementation outside of GraphQL JS before we merge it. For the spec, the experience with the defer implementation we had before, driven by the Apollo world, which was purely JavaScript, was like, I think we need to have a second implementation to verify that the assumptions we are making are valid outside of the JavaScript ecosystem. Like, I think this does not block anything, and it's not critical maybe right now, but in general, I would highly recommend that we consider this. Probably it will happen automatically after GraphQL JS is merged, and after some time people start around with it. I hope another implementation picks it up, but I think it's worthwhile thinking about it as a formal requirement because of this huge impact.
I'm comfortable with that. I know that they're basing a lot of decisions off of conversations with folks on the GraphQL server side team at Facebook who've been building this in a non-JavaScript language as well. But yeah, I think getting this, Andy, if you're interested in tackling this on the GraphQL Java side, just to make sure that there's no surprises, that's all super aligned with exactly what I described before about having high confidence in the implementation and looking for bugs. So if the more places that we do that upfront, the better. The more confidence we'll have that this is the right thing to land to the spec.
Yeah, I think we are. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, we are also targeting October for this with the next Novara server. And that's a .NET. It's very similar to the challenges Java will have.
Super exciting.
I think we are aligned on this. I agree. One specific thing, for example, I recall when we implemented the defer version, the Apollo defer version, was the transport layer was hugely unspecified or underspecified. So while you could implement it on the back end, how you would actually put it onto the client in terms of HTTP and stuff like this was hugely underspecified. And while we can leverage a kind of a implicit agreement in the ecosystem for normal GraphQL requests, we need to consider, especially for this, the transport layer is much, much more complex, right? And we need to tackle this explicitly by having something written down outside of a JS implementation.
Yeah, definitely. And I have not a spec, but an RFC for GraphQL over HTTP with all the details. Benji pointed out one change that I'm going to make, but if there's anything more that could be added there, definitely let me know.
That's already great that we have an extra document targeting this. This will help a lot.
Yeah, and we have a reference implementation of that in Express GraphQL, and I have a client library too. So
Great. Yeah, looking forward, Michelle, especially also to the .NET implementation to get to hear feedback. I'm not sure when GraphQL Java will tackle it, to be honest. We are definitely will do it like we implemented the defer for Apollo. We removed it actually recently complete, so we don't have defer anymore inside GraphQL Java. And but of course we will pick it up again at one point.
Yeah, I looked at it because when I started with defer, I also looked at the Apollo implementation, and the only non-GraphQL implementation that I found that implemented or started implementing this was GraphQL Java.
And I just want to clarify one thing. So I'm not merging with PR not because of some like problem with Spec. It's just that I'm JavaScript. I think iteratable have like some problem with leak and performance test and stuff. So it's like purely technical from JavaScript side. So on your side, it's like it can be totally independent from JavaScript. I don't expect anything in RFC to be changed based on PR to GraphQL.js. So it's purely issues with either JavaScript ecosystem or like GraphQL.js or like PR review process. And another idea in this context, actually, like since we started GraphQL working group, I'm like, if you want something from GraphQL.js or discuss something from GraphQL.js or change something in GraphQL.js, you can join in. So like Andy, I don't know if you joined before or after our discussion of GraphQL.js working group. So like as other language implementers, maybe you have something to contribute or to ask from GraphQL.js, maybe something will make your life easier. So we can discuss it on GraphQL.js working group if you have time to join or something to discuss.
Yeah, definitely happy to join the GraphQL.js meetings.
Thanks.
Awesome. Anything else you all need to keep this moving?
I think that's it.
Awesome. It's super exciting. I'm always happy to see that y'all have made progress, and there's always something interesting to talk about every month on this. So thank you all for continuing to move this forward. It's a long time coming. Andy, I'll hand it to you to give an update on GraphQL Scalars and anything you want to talk about there.
Yeah, there's nothing really to update, and that's actually the topic. I'm just want to encourage people to participate or to leave feedback. We have this GraphQL Scalars repository where we have a bunch of open issues where we want to discuss with the question that came up and how to progress. And yeah, I hope other people find this project also interesting and want to contribute like maybe a little bit more. I think it has the potential of having a huge impact in kind of extending the fundamental capabilities of GraphQL with more specified scalars. So I'm very excited about it, but we lack a little bit traction and engagement so far. So I'm also happy to think about or like to incorporate feedback how we could make this better, of course.
You mean the GraphQL Scalar website or?
No, the GraphQL Scalars repository inside the GraphQL
yeah, the website
organization in GitHub. And yeah, one specific topic I want to bring to your attention, Lee, is there's an open issue around how to approve pull requests. If somebody wants to contribute a custom scalar specification, it needs to be formally approved by the GraphQL like foundation agreement, right? So you can't merge something without a person having signed this contract. And it would be nice that we have some way of verifying this or some way of making sure this happened. It can be a totally manual process, but I think currently it's managed outside of the repository completely manually, right?
Yeah.
And that's totally fine, I think, but maybe we can make this more accessible to 1 or 2 people in the future, that we kind of not have a huge bottleneck on Brian or so. Yeah.
This came up
That's
earlier in the
formal
meeting,
thing.
actually. Yeah, Brian knows that if he can, so this is both the process of going through all of the paperwork is Brian's job, and then also the job to get this automation in place is Brian's job. So Brian will unblock Brian by landing that, so he's self-motivated to get that in. I know he's working on it.
That's a recursive problem you have to think you. That's interesting. Yeah, so any questions about this? Any suggestions maybe how we could increase the participation, or something the people here are lacking of understanding?
One thing I would start is license, because repo currently don't have any license. So I think it can be problematic. I think like first commit beyond README should have license. Otherwise, we will have, if we merge something with license, without license, it can be like problematic.
Yeah, this is why I created the specific issue and asked for advice from Brian or other foundation folks. What is actually the license? And I think we got an answer.
I missed the issue. Okay, so there is the issue.
Like,
okay.
Yeah, there's the issue contribution agreement and license, which explicitly asks this question because, yes, we need to address this.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's actually high value and not something that we had talked about last time we set this up. We originally talked about how this was a great place to just share Scalar implementations with sort of low friction. But it's a great point of like, how does someone know under what terms they're allowed to use these things? And that's one of the values that the GraphQL Foundation is giving us, is clear legal rules, which would just make it like, you could, if you see it, if it's under the GraphQL Foundation, you can use it. And applying that to everything that lands here is going to be a good thing. And tracking that is important. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. I think that gives us a really nice legal background, and we don't need to think about it further once we have the formal things in place. So that's really nice, even for this project. Yes.
Okay, I'll follow up with Brian and make sure that it's the make sure that he's prioritizing this, because it sounds like this is starting to block a handful of things. But yeah, OWFA is probably still the thing we'll roll with for everything that lands here. You can make that explicit.
I can help with license, because I had the same issue for GraphQL or HTTP, because I need to relicense it. So I asked Brian a bunch of questions. He shared like some blog article and answered them. So I'm not sure about agreement, but about license, I have like definitive answer on how to do it for GraphQL or HTTP or other foundation projects. So one thing, I can create PR because it's super simple. Basically, he explained it's like GraphQL contributors. You should attribute it not to GraphQL Foundation, but to GraphQL contributors. Another issue, I actually like to write some example or template of a license, so people don't ask this question. Where should I put it? What's the proper repo for putting example of license or template license or something?
There is a legal repo at the top that would be the right place to do that. Unless you're talking about specific to Scalars, in which case that also might be useful, is to just have like a template, which I know Andy was working on something kind of similar to that. And then if the legal pieces are just properly linked in that template, then anyone who follows the template will just automatically be good to go.
I don't see legal repo. I see.
It's called Foundation.
Okay, Foundation. Okay. So like if I create license example, or it should be markdown document, or how to better describe it.
Yep, markdown document. And you can also ask Brian for help. You can just offload that. Just tell him that you want that done, and he'll work with his legal team to make sure that that gets done correctly.
Because I just like 2 days ago, I asked him a bunch of questions and I already have answers. So
okay,
I can
cool.
create and ask him to review it. And
That works
hopefully
too.
it will licensing issue on all the repos, not only GraphQL Scalars. Ideally, we would add like new projects from time to time if we see value in it. So having or adopted, like we adopted 2 new projects like Scalars and GraphQL or HTTP in the last 2 months.
Sounds great. All right, that's the end of our written agenda. I know there were a handful of things we wanted to cover at the end. There were some spec related questions. Is that, I can't remember who was asking about that before.
Yeah, I wanted to ask like some questions regarding the spec. So can I go ahead with that?
Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you. So like my first question is that like there are like lists in GraphQL, and at the time of insertion, if I insert a list and there is an order, let's say 1, 2, 3, like I have 3 items in the list and I'm inserting them in some order. So then when I query them back, should they appear in the same order, or like the order in which or the order like in which they appear in the query for the first time should be repeated every time when they're queried?
To clarify, are you asking whether if you query a list multiple times, you should get a stable order?
Yes. So if I query a list multiple times, should I get a stable order? That is like, I think that is yes, because it's mentioned in the spec, I guess. But should that order be same as the order of insertion?
That's totally implementation specific. Some sort by some criteria on whatever is most reasonable for the use case.
Okay, so like even if it's not in the order of insertion, it's like completely fine if the output is always ordered.
I think I don't even know that the spec defines anything about order.
Yes, defines, and we actually had a problem with it. And you were strong proponent of having the same order as inside the query to match an order. And first, like couple version of spec was like with strong order. So basically, it's the same order as inquiry, the same order in response. Even if you use like inline fragments or anything.
That's the order of fields. Yeah, he's talking about like the values within a list.
That's
like
implementation detail.
I think like actually
the data order is not dictated by the spec. It's implementation.
Yeah, I remember it. Yeah, we actually added somebody added it. I think it's in spec saying it's insignificant.
I was just reading the spec, and like it's mentioned that basically a GraphQL list is a special collection type which declares the type of each item in the list, and list values are serialized as ordered lists.
Yeah. Okay. So the description there of saying that it's ordered implies that a consumer of the list should use a data structure that is ordered. It's totally fine if the documentation for such a field says the order of these values don't matter, in which case like you could do that, but it's not safe to always assume that. The initial assumption is that lists are ordered, unless stated otherwise by the implementation. But beyond that, there's the particular order that is used is completely implementation specific, depends on what it is that you're trying to model.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay. Okay.
Just if I have that right, it's, you wouldn't want to, when you're reading the JSON response, to BOGO sort your response, right?
Or you wouldn't want to use an intermediate data structure before you serialize to JSON. That's just like a set, you know, or like something that is an unordered data structure. Because if the implementation decided that like, hey, by the way, this list is sorted by recency or something like that, and then you failed to return this as an ordered list and you scrambled the order, then you would have lost semantics in the implementation. But the particular sort is, or whether it is sorted or not, or anything about the order itself is entirely dependent on the domain and not the spec.
Okay. 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 And like the other thing that I had was, so like basically with input unions, like I read like there was some RFC regarding input unions, and like there were a couple of 5 approaches, and I guess the last one, the 5th one, which is like using the one-off directive, I guess that one is weighing at the moment. And like, are there any other approaches that we are thinking of, or like, is there going to be like some decision on input unions? Like, is there some timeline or something like that I can know?
Benji, you want to give an update on that?
So it's sort of like, basically, if you've got a better solution, bring it to us, please. At the moment, we've met, the input unions doc is out of date. It's on us to update it. As actually mentioned earlier in the meeting, that is still a to-do that needs doing. I've been focusing my time on just updating the tagged union, the tagged type RFC itself, which I still have more work to do. That is what is replacing solution 5. So solution 5, as you say, is the one field or the one-of directive. We've decided that probably a better way of doing it is actually to add a new type to the GraphQL type system that actually models this properly, rather than doing it as just a directive that has quite significant effects on the fields on which you use it. So it seemed clearer to build it with a new type. That has meant that the spec is significantly larger than the spec that I first opened, and thus work is taking a little longer than expected. But it is progressing. As you say, though, if there are other solutions, we are happy to hear them. We are not 100% committed to the tag type yet. It is currently the leading one, but if a better one comes around, like, fantastic.
Yeah, so it was like just that we were kind of working on unions at the moment, and we were trying to implement them, and like we also like got this discussion in our mind that how would we do accept inputs for unions. So like we were just messing our head around it, and like then we found that there was already an RFC on it. So like I just wanted to ask if like there was some decision on it. So yeah, so yeah, so that is like now kind of clear to me that there are going to be some tag types, and basically they are better than the normal one-off directive. And when we were thinking, we were also thinking of using the same approach as the one-off directive one. And I guess if tag types are better, then we'll wait for them. And then the other thing that I had was yeah. So like when we say unions, so does it? There are basically 2 things. Like a union can contain basically a union represents some member types. So can all the nodes belonging to those member types be queried as a union, or like just some particular nodes which are actually part of some field in the graph, and that field is returning union. So like only those particular nodes should be representable by the union, or all the nodes which belong to the member types of the union should be representable by the union. Like, is it clear? Did I make it clear?
I think I'm not sure if this directly answers your question, but the union type, as you say, says that it's between two other or more, any number of output types. And it basically says if you say that a field will return a union type, then whatever it returns will be one of those types. It doesn't say it has to be. You could always return type A, even if you said it could be a type A, B, C, or D. You could always just return type A. But what you're saying is it will always be an A or a B or a C or a D. It can be any number of those nodes. It's not dependent on the data within those nodes themselves, so long as they conform to the type that they say they are within the union.
Okay. Okay, I guess I have the answer for my question, and the last thing that I wanted to ask is, like, I guess it may be a silly question, but so I have this case that there is an interface, and there are two types which implement the interface. Now, what I guess the current behavior in the spec is that if there is some field in the interface, then all the implementing types have to kind of again write that field inside the declaration. So if, like, what we have done in our implementation is that we have not mandated people to like write that field again and again in the implementing types, but if they just write it once in the interface and they say that this type A implements interface I, then they don't have to repeat the field again in the type A. We just like kind of get it from the interface and do it for them. So like, are there any disadvantages or any things that are already being thought about this thing, or like anything, any feedback that you may have?
Yeah, this point's been pretty well litigated in the past, and we've come down on the decision of making it clear at the concrete type, all of the fields that are provided. There's the reason for that. There's many reasons for that. One of them is a lesson learned from living in an object-oriented type system for far too long, where in order to understand all the things you can do with a particular type, you need to go follow the chain of a bunch of different things. And especially when you get things which implement things which implement things, especially since we now have interfaces which can implement interfaces, you often find yourself clicking around documentation considerably in order to determine the total set of things which are queryable. So we wanted to avoid that. That's at least from the introspection side, why when you ask for the fields of a particular object, you always get the total set. The other piece is that it's important to clarify intent. So an interface, you may specify a field which is more specific than what an interface suggests that you specify. For example, if an interface says this field has no arguments, you can supply a field which includes additional arguments because you've at least satisfied the interface and now you've gone beyond that. Or if your interface says I return something of a union type and your usage of that says actually I only ever return A. That's still, to Benji's point about unions before, that's compliant. A is in fact within that union, that is safe to do. That allows you to be crisp about the expectations of each particular type, even in the case when the expectation is equivalent to the interface. But rather than that being an implicit statement, it's an explicit statement. And the philosophic guideline here is that in general, GraphQL always wants to be more valuable to readers than it is to writers. And that is particularly notable for anyone who's writing the GraphQL, the SDL, the type system definition language. In a trade-off between what would be easier for someone to read versus what would be easier for someone to write, we always go in favor of what would be easier to read, even if that requires more typing, which is different from how a lot of other programming languages operate, but it's not really a programming language, it's a data definition language. And that's the philosophy that we've taken so far. So that's kind of the last trade-off, was if you're reading this, then you might read that this implements an interface and has 3 fields, and inadvertently arrive at the conclusion that such a type only has 3 fields, but fail to see that that interface in fact defines another one that you might have missed. So it's a way to avoid confusion.
Okay. Okay.
There's also the point that you're like, I work on a tooling team, so like we often have non-spec compliant specs lying around our code base, but our tooling takes those non-compliant specs and converts them into being spec compliant via like automated transforms. So like we abuse the SDL, but you have to, there's value in making sure that at some specific point your SDL is spec compliant, but various tooling and whatnot that you provide, it's up to you.
Okay. Thank you. So those were the only questions that I had. Thank you for your feedback and suggestions.
Of course. Anything else that anyone would like to cover while we're all here? It's the end of our written agenda.
Just a small note to say there's more stuff I've not done. I have made a little bit of progress on the query topic that you may remember from a few working groups ago.
Oh yes.
But I have yet to turn that into actual like a post on the relevant issue thread, because I've been focusing on tagged. I haven't forgotten about it. It is on my to-do list, but it's below tagged right now.
Good to know. Yeah, that's a A+ troll.
I wanted to ask a short question. Actually interested in input unions, but I didn't have the time to join a call. So is there any reason why you're not recording input union working group? And can it be recorded in future, especially since we now have a YouTube account?
I think they were recorded.
They were. We've not had many, Ivan. I think we had 2. Is that right, Lee?
I think there might have been 3 total.
So you have recordings. They're just not on YouTube.
At least one of them's on the YouTube.
One of them on YouTube. Okay, I missed that. Okay.
Yeah, I would consider we're now on the tailing edge of getting good hygiene of recording meetings, and I think the first of those meetings was maybe in April, if that's right. And I think it's possible that 1 or 2 of them was not recorded. I think the one in May was one where we made significant traction, so that one was recorded. We also, Benji, I think you took notes on those as well, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I've posted both the video link to YouTube and the notes that we took to the relevant issue that's in the action items that's linked in the top of the notes currently, I think. So yeah, it does exist.
So
but it does need digesting.
I only see input unions from 3 months ago on YouTube. Oh.
I think that's the last time we met.
I thought like you met this month because Benji just posted. It's like Benji posted notes for 3 months ago. Or
yeah.
is it...
Exactly.
Okay, because that was confusion. I thought you had a meeting like this month, and I thought I missed it, and I wanted to see video of it. Okay.
No, I just noticed that the issue on GitHub hadn't had any action for about 3 months, and I was like, well, I'll at least post something here. Maybe it will help.
Yes, something better than nothing, and wait better than never.
Yep, that's the ethos of our group. Sorry to be self-deprecating. One other thing I wanted to ask y'all is, right now we manage RFCs in the GraphQL spec repo, but then the actual discussion and notes happens in the GraphQL working group repo. I wanted to pose a potential suggestion to basically move the RFC folder from the GraphQL spec repo to the GraphQL WG repo, just so that all of the stuff that's like about ongoing RFCs is in one place. And that way the GraphQL spec from here on forward would be like purely about the things that actually land. Obviously the exception there would be a actual pull request to the spec text. But that way, like stuff that's work in flight, that's not quite at the phase where it's a spec PR, can have a place that has a lower barrier to entry for merging changes.
I think that's a great idea.
Cool. Any concerns? Try not to screw it up.
So just to clarify, if we merge RFC into GraphQL working group, and we're not in a stage that we have PR against a spec, how person can track stages? So like right now, he can go to PRs and see like what is the stage of every proposal, is in issues or in PRs, how it's done if you don't have if we merge RFC into working group and it's moved there, and if we keep all the issues in working group, so we basically have a split between like small issues on GraphQL spec and big issues on working group. So without any table or anything, it would be confusing for like people prepare talks. Rob gave a good talk about, so like for people who want to monitor what's happening, it would be harder for them.
That's a good point. I will probably add something to the README that makes it clear that proactive discussion around proposals for change happen in the working group, and to point there, just so that if people find themselves here and they want to find that stuff, they can go there. The reason why I propose this is that it brings us one step closer to a place where I'd like to get to, where we can have sort of a master list of all of the topics under discussion, who their champions are, and then where the relevant content is. Right now, that's just kind of like in agendas month to month, and that's okay. But as we take on more things, and as the set of people who join these meetings continues to grow and rotate, I want to make sure that we're not losing stuff. So that's kind of my intent with unifying those things.
I also would say that this gives more value to all events from the GraphQL spec repo. Like I'm getting notifications for every single thing in the GraphQL spec repo, and kind of separating this would make it like the signals more valuable, because then every pull request inside there, which is not garbage, is really like high value and really discussed, and it's separated from the initial more chatty upfront discussion, right? So this is my personal benefit from it.
That's exactly right.
sorry, does this mean that it would make sense to actually turn off issues on the GraphQL spec repo and have the issues only on the working group repo and keep it as pull requests only on the spec?
That is a good question.
That's
I don't know.
I don't know.
I feel like we get decently high value things that come through issues. And it is, I think, worthwhile to have a distinction between issues against the spec versus, like, right now we use issues for the working group for internal action items, things that we need to take action on as a working group. And it might be worthwhile, like, I think it might be worthwhile to keep that separate, but I don't know. I don't have a strong opinion.
You want to not discourage people to ask questions and engage, right? Like, I don't know, maybe a GraphQL spec without any issues is kind of a high entry burden for people who are not sure what to do. And I don't feel like we're getting spammed inside the GraphQL spec with issues. So I like the idea, but maybe it's a little bit too far. Just a gut feeling.
Yeah. And just to clarify, I think it's okay that issues for RFCs and pull requests for RFCs continue to exist in the GraphQL spec repo. Really, the piece that I saw that would be worthwhile to move to the working group are these work in progress documents. The RFC folder specifically has these work in progress documents that kind of litter the commit history of the spec repo, and just like there's a maintenance burden of teasing apart what are pull requests and issues that are relative to internal discussion amongst the working group and what are relevant to just this final spec changes themselves. That's the clarification that I wanted to draw.
Actually, I think we can, if we write a document with policies, we can, if somebody become a champion, we can just give them commit rights. If we have a policy of like how much time PR should be open to get review comments and what can be merged immediately. So like it would be self-service. I think it's because, like, for example,
yeah,
I merged some stuff from more stream and defer PR, but some stuff need to be rebased. So I ping Rob to rebase them, and Rob rebase. It's another like couple of weeks before I have a chance to look into this repo. So it's like slow down things. So yeah, I actually in that case I see a value of more empowering champions to actually do their own maintenance. And we have like fast progress. Vince help a lot when he merged like bunch of stuff without waiting for merger. So I think like
it's a good point.
Actually,
yeah, we can be much more liberal with giving commit access to the WG repo for. We don't really have a good definition of what a core contributor is versus a visiting contributor. That's okay. Like anyone who's like a frequent guest of these meetings will just start to give commit access to, and that's probably reasonable. And if we need to define it further than that, we will.
Especially champions. I think like we have a clear definition right now. So if you champion something and you have RFC, you have you promise not to merge anything in other person RFC, so only in your own RFC. And I think GitHub have some mechanism for that when you can assign folders to reviewers or something.
Good point. Okay, I will take an action item to make that happen. Okay, everybody, that's our full agenda for the day. Thank you all for joining. I hope you're all safe and happy and your families are all healthy. Look forward to seeing everybody next month and continuing to make progress on all the things we're doing in our own little bubble in a crazy world. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Right.
Thanks, everyone.